In the early decades of the 19th century, Europe stood at the edge of transformation. The continent was emerging from the upheavals of revolution and war. Empires had redrawn borders. Monarchies had reasserted authority. Yet beneath the surface of political restoration, another force was reshaping daily life at a far deeper level. Industrialization was beginning to alter the structure of European society. In parts of Britain, coal and steam powered new forms of production. Textile mills expanded along rivers and canals. Ironworks glowed through the night. In regions of Belgium, northern France, and western Germany, similar changes followed. For the first time in history, large numbers of people worked not in fields or small workshops, but in centralized factories. This transformation disrupted centuries-old patterns of life. Rural families who had relied on seasonal rhythms and communal support increasingly migrated to cities. Urban populations grew at unprecedented speed. In London, Paris, Berlin, and Manchester, crowded neighborhoods formed almost overnight. Housing struggled to keep pace. Sanitation systems lagged behind. Employment, though expanding, remained unstable and uneven. Poverty was not new to Europe. For centuries, communities had managed hardship through local charity, church relief, and parish-based assistance. The poor were divided into categories: the deserving and the undeserving, the elderly and infirm, the able-bodied, unemployed. Relief was often minimal, designed less to eliminate poverty than to prevent starvation and disorder. Economic downturns sent thousands into sudden destitution. Governments began to confront a pressing question. Was poverty a personal failing, a moral weakness requiring discipline, or was it a structural condition produced by economic transformation? The answer to that question would shape welfare policy for generations. Across Europe, responses differed. In Britain, sweeping reforms reshaped the administration of poor relief. In German states later unified under Prussian leadership, early forms of social insurance began to emerge. In France and Scandinavia, local traditions intersected with growing state involvement. Religious institutions continued to play a role, but secular governments increasingly took responsibility. By mid-century, poverty was no longer seen solely as an unfortunate but inevitable feature of life. It had become a political issue. It influenced public health policy, labor regulation, and debates over citizenship. Urban overcrowding exposed the connection between poverty and disease. Industrial accidents revealed the vulnerability of workers. Social unrest demonstrated that neglect carried consequences. The 19th century did not eliminate poverty. In many regions, it intensified before conditions improved. But it did transform how European societies understood responsibility for economic hardship. What had once been a local, moral question slowly became a national, administrative one. This shift laid the foundations of the modern welfare state. As the 19th century advanced, the pressures created by industrialization became increasingly visible. Europe's population rose dramatically between 1800 and 1900. Improvements in agriculture reduced famine in many regions, while medical advances, though limited, lowered mortality rates. More people survived into adulthood. More families moved towards cities in search of wages. Urban growth outpaced infrastructure. In industrial centers such as Manchester, Lille, and the Ruhr Valley, entire districts emerged without adequate drainage, clean water, or ventilation. Overcrowded housing concentrated poverty into dense urban pockets. Diseases such as cholera and typhus spread rapidly through these environments, linking poverty directly to public health crises. Employment in factories offered wages, but rarely security. Industrial work followed market demand. When trade slowed, factories closed. When mechanization improved efficiency, fewer workers were needed. Skilled artisans who had once controlled their craft found themselves competing with machines and cheaper labor. Periodic economic downturns in the 1820s, 1840s, and 1870s revealed how vulnerable wage-dependent households had become. Traditional systems of support struggled to cope. Parish-based poor relief in rural areas had been designed for small, stable communities. It was not equipped to handle tens of thousands of urban laborers facing cyclical unemployment. Charity organizations multiplied, but donations fluctuated with the economy. Relief was often uneven and insufficient. Ever wonder how we went from seeing poverty as a personal failure to a social responsibility? The 19th century in Europe was a major turning point. The Industrial Revolution was booming, creating incredible wealth, but also widespread poverty. Early on, the response was often harsh. Think of Britain's 1834 Poor Law, which forced the poor into grim workhouses to discourage them from seeking help. The idea was that poverty was a moral failing. But as the century wore on, things began to shift. The 1848 revolutions across Europe showed that widespread hardship could spark major political unrest. Governments started to realize that ignoring poverty was risky. Social investigators began documenting the harsh realities of factory life and cramped city slums, making poverty impossible to ignore. In places like Germany, the first state-sponsored insurance schemes emerged to protect workers. It was a slow, uneven process, but the conversation was changing. The question was no longer if the state should help, but how. This laid the groundwork for the social welfare systems we know today. Thanks for watching. Ever wonder how we went from simply giving a coin to someone in need to having complex social welfare systems? Let's take a trip back to the late 19th century in Europe. Back then, helping the poor was mostly a local affair, handled by churches and small charities. It was personal, but also inconsistent and often overwhelmed. But then, something big changed. The rise of social science people actually studying poverty with data, and statistics showed that this was a huge national problem, not just a local one. At the same time, governments were getting more organized and powerful. Putting these two together, a new idea was born. A structured, national approach to poverty. This wasn't just about charity anymore. It was about creating systems to manage poverty on a massive scale. This shift laid the groundwork for the social safety nets many countries have today. It was a revolutionary change in how society cares for its most vulnerable. Thanks for watching, and subscribe for more history. The growth of trade unions and political parties further influenced this transformation. Socialist and social democratic movements advocated for protective legislation and social security. Conservative governments, wary of unrest, often adopted welfare measures as stabilizing tools. In this sense, welfare expansion served both humanitarian and political purposes. Administration grew more systematic. Eligibility criteria were formalized. Contributions were calculated, benefits were standardized. The language of welfare shifted from charity to insurance, from alms to rights. This bureaucratic approach reduced arbitrariness, though it also introduced complexity and exclusions. Yet the system did not cover everyone. Agricultural workers, informal laborers, domestic servants, and many women remained partially or entirely outside contributory frameworks. Regional disparities persisted, particularly between industrialized Northern Europe and rural Eastern regions. Colonial territories remained largely excluded from the protections being constructed in metropolitan centers. Even with limitations, the late 19th century marked the point at which poverty relief became embedded in the architecture of governance. Welfare was no longer an emergency response to crisis. It became a permanent function of the state. This shift carried long-term consequences. Once governments accepted responsibility for managing social risk, expectations expanded. Economic downturns, workplace injuries, illness, and aging were no longer viewed as isolated misfortunes. They were predictable features of industrial society, requiring structured response. By the century's end, Europe had not eliminated poverty, but it had built the administrative and ideological foundations for modern welfare states. The system had begun to take over. By the late 19th century, the scale of poverty in Europe could no longer be described only in moral or anecdotal terms. It was increasingly measured in numbers. Population growth alone reshaped the social landscape. Europe's population rose from roughly 190 million in 1800 to more than 400 million by 1900. Cities absorbed much of that increase. London surpassed 6 million inhabitants by the century's end. Paris approached 3 million. Berlin's population multiplied several times over within a few decades. Industrial districts concentrated tens of thousands of workers within confined urban spaces. Wages did rise over the century, particularly in more industrialized regions, but income growth was uneven and vulnerable to downturns. Periods of rapid expansion were followed by recessions that exposed structural fragility. The Long Depression, beginning in the 1870s, slowed growth across parts of Europe, pushing many households back towards subsistence. Ever wonder what life was really like for the average person during the Industrial Revolution? We often hear about the incredible inventions and booming factories, but there's a darker side to that story that changed society forever. Let's pull back the curtain on the widespread poverty that defined this era for millions. Before the Industrial Revolution, most people lived in rural areas, working the land. Life was hard, but it had a certain rhythm. Then came the machines. Factories sprang up in cities, promising jobs and a new way of life. Waves of people left their farms and flooded into urban centers, hoping for a better future. What they found was often a nightmare. Cities grew so fast they couldn't keep up. Families were crammed into tiny, filthy tenements, often with no running water or sanitation. Streets were choked with smoke from coal-powered factories, and diseases like cholera and typhoid spread like wildfire. The work itself was grueling and dangerous. People worked 12 to 16-hour days, 6 days a week, in factories with no safety regulations. Accidents were common, and the pay was barely enough to survive. For children, it was even worse. Their small size made them ideal for crawling under dangerous machinery or working in tight coal mine tunnels. Many children as young as 5 were forced to work long hours for a fraction of an adult's wage, robbing them of their health, education, and childhood. These weren't just isolated cases. This was the reality for a huge portion of the working class. But this period of intense hardship also planted the seeds of change. Workers began to organize, forming unions to demand better wages, safer conditions, and shorter hours. The struggle was long and often met with fierce resistance, but it sparked a movement for workers' rights that continues to this day. The poverty of the Industrial Revolution serves as a stark reminder of the human cost of progress and the importance of fighting for a fair and just society. What do you think is the most important lesson we can learn from this period? Let me know in the comments below. Thanks for watching, and if you found this interesting, be sure to like and subscribe for more dives into history. See you next time. Housing conditions intensified vulnerability. Overcrowded tenements housed multiple families in confined spaces. Ventilation was poor. Clean water was not always available. In such environments, disease spread rapidly. Epidemics exposed how closely poverty and mortality were linked. Infant mortality rates in working-class districts were often significantly higher than in wealthier neighborhoods of the same city. For women, poverty carried distinct burdens. Many worked in domestic service, textile production, or informal labor markets. Wages were typically lower than those of male workers. Widows, unmarried mothers, and elderly women faced heightened risk of destitution. Relief systems frequently evaluated moral character alongside need, subjecting female applicants to scrutiny that reinforced social hierarchies. Children experienced poverty, both as laborers and as dependents. In industrial regions, child labor contributed to household income. Although reform laws gradually limited hours and introduced compulsory schooling, enforcement was inconsistent during much of the century. Malnutrition and limited access to education restricted long-term opportunity. Poverty thus reproduced itself across generations. Seasonal workers and rural laborers faced different forms of insecurity. Agricultural wages fluctuated with harvest yields and market prices. Mechanization displaced traditional roles in some regions, reducing demand for manual labor. In Southern and Eastern Europe, where industrialization advanced more slowly, poverty remained closely tied to land access and rural inequality. Relief systems often imposed conditions. Workhouses in Britain were intentionally austere, designed to deter all but the most desperate applicants. On the continent, assistance could require proof of residence or moral standing. While these policies reduced abuse in the eyes of administrators, they also discouraged legitimate claims and deepened stigma. Despite hardship, working-class communities developed resilience. Informal networks of mutual support operated alongside formal institutions. Neighbors shared food, credit, and childcare. Religious organizations continued to provide us. Industrialization also created avenues for gradual improvement. By the final decades of the century, wages in some regions began to rise more steadily. Public health initiatives reduced certain disease rates. Expanded education improved literacy and skill levels. These changes did not erase inequality, but they moderated its most extreme consequences. The human impact of 19th century poverty was neither uniform nor static. It evolved with economic cycles, regional development, and political reform. For many families, life remained precarious. Yet over time, the growing involvement of the state altered expectations. Assistance, once seen as charity for the desperate, slowly came to be regarded as a social mechanism to prevent collapse. These human consequences, measured in both suffering and adaptation, shaped the political climate that would carry Europe into the 20th century. By the closing decades of the 19th century, European societies were no longer reacting to poverty as an unexpected disruption. They were adapting to it as a structural feature of industrial life. Governments refined administrative systems to manage expanding welfare responsibilities. Statistical bureaus collected regular data on employment, wages, housing, density, and mortality. Policymaking increasingly relied on evidence rather than assumption. Social reform became a permanent element of parliamentary debate. Labor movements played a decisive role in shaping this adaptation. Trade unions grew in size and coordination, particularly in Britain, Germany, and parts of Scandinavia. Organized strikes pushed for higher wages, shorter working hours, and safer conditions. Political parties aligned with labor interests entered legislative bodies, transforming social protection from a charitable concern into a matter of political representation. Employers also adapted. Some industrialists introduced limited welfare initiatives within their enterprises' housing projects, medical services, or pension funds, partly to improve worker stability and partly to discourage unionization. While these programs varied widely in quality and scope, they reflected recognition that a stable workforce required more than wages alone. Religious institutions continued to influence social policy. Catholic and Protestant organizations supported charitable networks, schools, and hospitals. In certain regions, religious social teaching encouraged cooperation between labor and capital. Although secular governments expanded authority, faith-based institutions remained embedded in welfare provision. Municipal governments assumed greater responsibility for urban living standards. Investments in sewer systems, street paving, regulated housing, construction, and public hospitals reshaped city environments. These interventions improved not only public health, but also economic productivity. Cleaner, healthier cities reduced epidemic risk and absenteeism. At the same time, limitations persisted. Welfare coverage remained uneven across regions and professions. Women's access to benefits was often mediated through male employment. Rural populations in Southern and Eastern Europe frequently lacked the protections available in industrial centers. Colonial territories, though economically linked to European prosperity, rarely received equivalent safeguards. Despite these disparities, the 19th century established expectations that would shape the 20th. When economic crises struck, whether in the form of recession, war, or structural unemployment, public demand for expanded protection intensified rather than diminished. Governments could modify programs, but abandoning them entirely became politically unthinkable. The foundations laid during this period influenced later developments, including broader unemployment insurance, family allowances, and comprehensive pension systems. In the decades that followed, the concept of the welfare state, often associated with the 20th century, rested firmly on 19th century precedents. Industrialization had created new forms of vulnerability. In response, Europe developed new forms of collective security. Poverty remained present, but its management became institutional rather than ad hoc. By the dawn of the 20th century, Europe was no longer debating whether social risk required state involvement. It was debating how far that involvement should extend. The 19th century began with local alms and parish oversight. It ended with national insurance systems and expanding public administration. Across Europe, poverty moved from the margins of moral discussion into the center of political life. Industrial growth brought extraordinary wealth, but it also revealed the fragility of wage-dependent existence. Cities concentrated opportunity and hardship in equal measure. Statistics gave hardship a measurable scale. Reformers gave it language. Governments gave it structure. The solutions remained incomplete. Millions continued to live with insecurity. Entire regions lagged behind emerging welfare models. Yet the direction of change was unmistakable. Responsibility for managing poverty had shifted from scattered charity to organized governance. The modern welfare state did not appear fully formed. It emerged gradually from 19th century debates over work, risk, discipline, and social stability. Policies that began as limited insurance schemes would expand in the century to follow. Expectations of protection would grow stronger. Citizenship itself would become linked to social rights. The story of poverty in 19th century Europe is not only a story of hardship, it is also a story of institutional adaptation. Faced with industrial transformation, European societies built systems to contain its consequences. Those systems reshaped politics, economics, and the relationship between individuals and the state. The legacy remains visible today. Social insurance, public health systems, labor protections, and pension schemes all trace part of their lineage to this period of transition. In the span of 1 century, poverty ceased to be treated solely as private misfortune. It became a matter of public structure, and in that shift, the foundations of modern social policy were laid.